Okay, so this project, for those of you who are chomping at the bit to do something representational and naturalistic, is representational and naturalistic. So this is like drawing or painting from life. It's sculpting from life. So we're going to create sculptures that are based on observed proportions. Proportions are like the size of the parts to the whole. So I have my whole hand, then I have the size of the palm, size of the fingers, size of the fingernails, relative to the size of my hand, right? I've got my head. That's a size, that's a scale, that's a shape. And within that shape, primary shape, there are secondary shapes like eyes, eyebrows, lips, nose, beard hairs, etc. Those are all parts of the whole. So proportions are size of the parts to the whole. Scale is how big you make something overall. Does that make sense? So Kennedy, if you could hold up your sculpture, I could make that sculpture 20 feet tall where we could walk underneath it. The proportion of that red hole would be the same relative to a 20-foot tall sculpture as it is to a 10-inch tall sculpture. Does that make sense? So we're just scaling up. And that's important in this project, and I'll get to that momentarily. But the proportions are where the rubber meets the road as far as naturalism is concerned. So, when you're drawing a figure, a common mistake is to make the eyes too big relative to the head, and then it looks either childlike or cartoonish. Not that that's bad, but it is if we're being naturalistic, right? Another thing with proportions is not just size, but placement. So for instance, the height of my middle finger from top to base is the same as the height of my palm. Does that make sense? So if I was to divide this shape in half, fingers fit above the top line, palm lower line. Does that make sense? So it's the size of those and it's the placement of those that creates a well-drawn hand or a well-sculpted hand. So studying those primary and secondary contours of the object and how they fit within that whole is going to be really important. So here's a diagram, for instance, of human proportion. So when you're creating a figure, it doesn't matter whether it's 100 feet tall or 100 centimeters tall, the groin is always going to be the halfway point. Always. Always, always, always. That's just a proportional standard, barring some sort of difference in the kind of average human being. The head is, generally speaking, about 1/8 of the entirety of the figure. It's actually the figure is 7 3/4 heads high. I just say 8. It's easier to deal with as a round number. And then from here to here is one head, from here to here is another head, from here to here is another head, and from here to here is another head. So there's 4 heads between the groin and the top of the head. And then from here to here, middle of the femur is a head, from here to knee is another head, and so forth and so on. So those proportional arrangements are really important if you want a naturalistic human figure. Now, we're not doing a human figure. We're doing a piece of food. It can be fruit, vegetable, spaghetti. It could be ice cream sundae. It could be a birthday cake. It could be asparagus. It could be anything you can, dog food, anything. So think food. Be creative, obviously. An orange is probably not going to be as interesting as pizza or escargot. You know what escargot is? Snails. It's really good, actually. I like escargot. I didn't think I'd like it, but it's garlicky, and anything is good with garlic, in my opinion. So we're going to kind of flex our eye about proportions by applying that to some sort of food. Our goal is to be naturalistic. Naturalism is realism, okay? So our goal is to fool the eye of the viewer. And speaking of French, escargot, French is the theme today. We've talked about Paris. Trompe l'oeil means fool the eye. So art that is uber naturalistic is meant to fool the eye. Here's an apple cast in bronze. So this would be a naturalistic sculpture of an apple, albeit the color is different, right? But the proportions of this apple, boring as they are accurately portrayed within this bronze sculpture. This is much more interesting. Yes? Now, one of the things about this project, and I'll reiterate this later, is that you're going to do at least 2 states of the project. States of being. Of the food item. So this is a whole apple. This is an eaten apple. That's 2 states of that object. Does that make sense? This is more interesting because it's more organic, right? It's more irregular. Plus, it indicates an activity. Something has happened, right? So we tell a story in our head of somebody chewing on the apple core or the apple. Pumpkin. Again, not naturalistic in color. I think the more deformed, like if you are going to do a standard piece of fruit, like the more deformed it is, the more interesting it is, right? So this tomato is more interesting than just a normal tomato, right? In addition to the primary and secondary contours, we're going to look at those textures, which of course are the tertiary aspects of the sculpture. So the very small stuff. And clay, which is what we're going to be using air-dried clay, not kiln-fired clay, is, as I said, kind of a reductive, additive process. You're kind of working between these two. So you start off with a block of clay, then you reduce it, maybe hollow it out, and then you maybe add some other stuff back to it. So it's kind of like an ebb and flow between additive and subtractive processes. And as you move towards tertiary details, you're getting finer and finer with your modeling. Modeling means kind of an elastic or plastic manipulation of the surface, in this case to get the primary, secondary, and most importantly, the tertiary contours, because clay has a really nice memory to it. Like it'll hold texture really well. Does anybody know what this is? Pomegranate. So, I like the idea of the cutaway. That's another way to make a fruit more interesting, right? So you've got an onion, and then you've got a peeled onion, right? So here's a pomegranate that has that cutaway, which shows us what the outside of the fruit looks like as well as the inside. So here's a cutaway of, what is this? Say again? Artichoke. I keep wanting to say asparagus. Artichoke. Okie dokie artichoke. So here's a whole artichoke, and then here's, the artichoke sliced in half. Now, another aspect that could be constructive with the project, constructive meaning cutting out individual parts and putting them together, is like this, right? You could literally cut out the individual artichoke leaves and lay them in, as opposed to just carving lines. What would you imagine would be more naturalistic? Actually layering them, right? Carving lines is going to not be as convincing as actually, layering over these aspects. Garlic. Now, one of the limitations of this project is going to be tiny tendril-like things. They're going to be very fragile. So what we wind up doing with things like this is we use wire. And like if we have a really long stem, but we need it to be thicker, we use wire with clay wrapped around it. Does that make sense? Because even with like kiln-fired clay, those little hairy things would just get broken like that. So you have to create an armature, which is like a skeletal reinforcement underneath that's going to be helpful. A gourd. All right, so as I was saying previously, we do want variation, right? Dynamic, compositional interest. So having on the one hand, two states of being or configurations or variations on our food, open versus closed, solid versus hollow, a mass versus a volume, whole versus part, right versus rotten, very static and stiff versus something that's more twisted and dynamic. So, having a twist like this is going to be better than just a straight up, piece of fruit. Does that make sense? And then the final stage is coloring. So here's like an avocado, right? No, not an avocado. Kiwi, sorry. It's brown on the outside, green on the inside, but a different kind of brown. All right, so a kiwi. It's a little bright, I think, the intensity. I like you can see they made that really nice rough texture. What they did was they took sandpaper and just kind of abraded the surface to get that to kind of twist up and become hairy. And then, they've got a whole artichoke. They've got an artichoke, kiwi that has had the fruit removed. And then they have the cutaway kiwi. And in here, in addition to creating the seeds, they've also colored them to create difference of contrast of color. Again, I think it's a little bit too intense, the color. So I would have recommended maybe pushing it a little bit more neutral in the greenishness of it. Here's a pineapple. Now, a lot of this is a combination of actual sculpture and incised, and then increasing the dimensionality by using paint to kind of intensify it, right? So by incising and then painting darker lines on top of it, they're intensifying the effect of a crevice shadow. Does that make sense to everybody? These leaves, they had to put wires in order to keep them stout and steady. So just keep that in mind. A pumpkin and a carved rotten pumpkin that's like sagging and gross. So that's kind of cool, to think about different states of being, rotten versus whole. I love the stem. I think they did a really good job on the trompe l'oeil of the stem. And even here, you've got kind of reddish and then orange and then yellowy orange colors. So it's not just a flat color. To me, this is too flat. It needs more variation in color. The leaves are too shamrocky, right? They too need to be neutralized a little bit, right? So, we don't want these to look like cartoons. We want them to look naturalistic, or as naturalistic as possible. Sausage biscuit with the raw sausage and then the biscuit itself. Now, another thing you can do is exaggerate scale. So look at how you got this huge strawberry, right? It would be very hard to do a tiny strawberry at scale. And if you think about it, this is a smaller scale as opposed to an actual scale pumpkin, right? We don't have enough clay for that. This is about to scale, maybe a little smaller. These are to scale. But to me, what's interesting is scaling up small things. That's an interesting dynamic. Does that make sense? Not to mention the fact that you would be hard-pressed to do little tiny seeds at that scale. Okay? The other thing that's nice here, I know we're about to go, is she used gloss medium and then matte medium to have that matte surface versus the shiny surface. So that's another aspect. I like this one, corn and popcorn. Look at that huge piece of popcorn. It was like this big. So,
Said it looks good.
Yeah, popcorn. So over the weekend, you want to make get some photos, at least 5 photos of your object. Okay, that's it. When we come back, we'll draw a little bit from those photos, and then we'll get started with the clay. Okay? This project goes really quick compared to the last project. All right, well, you guys have a good weekend, and we'll see you on Tuesday. Make sure you finish these sculptures up. If you have any questions, feel free to email me.